Not long ago, my partner and I were rewatching The Sound of Music on TV, and within the first couple minutes, I had burst into tears. Maybe it was a wave of nostalgia, maybe it was that second Negroni that was hitting me, or maybe it was just me being, probably all of the above, but I'll lean heavily on the nostalgia factor. The Sound of Music was a huge part of my childhood. In fact, I grew up watching many of the Rodgers and Hammerstein movie musicals. Rodgers and Hammerstein, of course, is the writing team, made up of Richard Rodgers and Oscar Hammerstein II. Beginning in the 1940s, their shows revolutionized the musical theater, where a strong story and fully developed characters became an essential part of a successful musical. Now, they weren't without their failures, and some of their pieces, as we've discussed in a previous episode, haven't aged all too well. But their mark on the art form is undeniable, and many of their shows are still popular with audiences today. But I would argue that you wouldn't have Rodgers and Hammerstein if it weren't for Rodgers and Hart. In the beginning of his career, Richard Rodgers wrote with lyricist Lorenz Hart. Now, even if you've never heard of Rodgers and Hart, you know their songs. Many of them are standards and are still heard today in countless films, TV shows, and covered by contemporary popular artists. Unlike the partnership of Rodgers and Hammerstein, Rodgers and Hart are generally remembered more for their songs over their shows. And though their partnership is a celebrated one, the Rodgers and Hart story is marked with tragedy, ending with Hart's death at the age of 48. It's a story marked with ambiguity, missing and conflicting facts, partly attributed to Larry's complicated private life, and an emotionally distant Dick Rodgers who some accuse of failing to come to his writing partner's aid. It's a story prone to sensationalism and misinformation that has become accepted as fact in the myth of their partnership. While I know I won't be able to fill in all of the blanks, I think this is a story that is due for as comprehensive a study as possible. This is a story about two very complicated men who, in spite of their two very different personalities, would help shape the course of the American musical. In November of 1943, the United States was at war, and cities like New York were under threat of enemy bombings. Nevertheless, crowds gathered at the Martin Beck Theater to watch the opening night revival of Rodgers and Hart's A Connecticut Yankee. Shortly after the beginning of the second act, the performance was interrupted by a voice at the back of the theater, loudly attempting to sing along with actress Vivian Siegel. It was Larry Hart, inebriated and out of control. At the instruction of Dick Rodgers, his former partner was quickly escorted out of the opening night of his own show. Not long before this, Rodgers and Hart had been one of Broadway's most successful writing teams, but the success they found together was hardly likely, given their differences. Both were born and raised in New York City at the turn of the 20th century to upper-middle-class Jewish families. From an early age, Dick Rodgers was known as a reserved personality who, early in his childhood, showed a promise for composing. Larry Hart, on the other hand, was gregarious, well-read, and already trying his hand at poetry. Both, having expressed a desire to write for the theater, were introduced by a mutual friend in the spring of 1919. In the parlor of the Hart family household on West 119th Street, the two sat down to talk for the first time. Larry was 23, Dick just 16.
The first impression I had of him was pretty much of a nut.
He was short. He's a little bit of a fella. But if you took a good look at his face and tried to dissociate his face from his body, you would have found an extraordinarily handsome one.
Both Dick and Larry showed an admiration for Broadway composer Jerome Kern, then writing for intimate musicals down at the Princess Theater on 39th Street. With his knack for turning a clever rhyme, Larry had strong ideas about how to engage the audience.
The first day I met Larry Hart, we understood each other. We had the same viewpoint toward writing for the musical theater, and we worked together until just before Larry died, when he wasn't able to work anymore.
Before the end of 1919, Dick and Larry managed to squeeze a song of theirs into a Broadway show, but would spend the next few years having their works rejected by publishers and theater producers alike. While Larry may have wanted to push the boundaries with sophisticated verse, Broadway, along with the rest of America, were looking for relief, American soldiers had just returned from the trenches of Europe, the Volstead Act had passed, and the 20s were just beginning to roar and flap. Needless to say, everyone wanted to have a good time. Dick and Larry would occasionally showcase their work in student varsity shows at Columbia University. But beyond that, it was literally years of just knocking on people's doors, submitting materials, and waiting for someone to give them a chance. Like, wow, totally relatable content. Then in 1925, Dick and Larry won the opportunity to co-write a review as a fundraiser for the Theater Guild, a theatrical society that produced works for Broadway. The review, titled the Garrick Gaieties, was scheduled to run a weekend in May. But the show's unexpected success would extend its run for 25 weeks. Much of this success is attributed to this song.
We'll have Manhattan, the Bronx and Staten Island too.
It's lovely going through Ballroom.
It's very fancy, an old Delancey Street, you know.
The subway charms us so when balmy breezes blow
To and fro. And tell me what street compares with Mott Street in July. Sweet pushcarts gently gliding by.
The success of the Garrick Gaieties paved the way for Rodgers and Hart, who would go on to write over a dozen Broadway shows over the next 5 years. Now, the musicals of the 1920s weren't the musicals like we think of them today. Think more like flimsy plot lines as an excuse for an elaborate review. I mean, there was that, one exception, but anyway, Rodgers and Hart were now recognized as one of Broadway's most successful composing teams.
We'll turn
Manhattan into an
of a joy.
After you met Larry Hart for the first time, Dick, you've been quoted as saying that in one afternoon you acquired a new career, a partner, a best friend, and a constant source of irritation. And what did you mean by a constant source of irritation?
Well, I find a constant source of irritation is a fellow who says he'll be at your house with the lyric at 2 o'clock and shows up on Friday. Mm-hmm. And that's the way Larry worked.
Early in their partnership, Dick Rodgers had grown accustomed to Larry Hart's sudden disappearances, sometimes for days at a time. While remembered for being a jubilant and generous figure, Larry was also noted for his bouts of depression. Paired with his dependency of alcohol, these disappearances were all the more worrisome. Larry Hart's homosexuality, a fact that is generally accepted today, was still a taboo subject in his lifetime. Even in the theater world, this is still a time where queer people were tolerated rather than accepted. Prohibition, and especially in cities like New York, offered many avenues for queer people to socialize, like speakeasies, where there was often a mixed clientele. There were also avenues like the Everard Baths on 28th Street, Bryant Park, or the Ramble in Central Park, where men would meet for brief sexual encounters. It's more than possible that Larry may have frequented some or all of these avenues, but discretion was a necessity at this time in history, and we may never know for sure. The crash of the stock market in October 1929 would cause a devastating blow to the Broadway theater world. Rodgers and Hart, along with other Broadway songwriters, would make the move out to Hollywood to write songs for movies, their first assignment being The Hot Heiress with Warner Brothers Studios. The movie industry had steadily grown through the 1920s, and following the success of The Jazz Singer, the first talkie motion picture, studios quickly expanded production. While the movie musical was still in its infancy, 50% of American films released in 1929 were musical or semi-musical, with 130 songwriters under contract by 9 of the major movie studios. However, by the time Rodgers and Hart arrived in Hollywood in 1930, production of movie musicals had been reduced to 5%, with half of the contracted songwriters being dismissed. Fortunately, Rodgers and Hart would be contracted by Paramount Studios to write the score of Love Me Tonight, starring Jeanette MacDonald and Maurice Chevalier. The success of this film would lead to their next project, Hallelujah, I'm a Bum, starring Al Jolson. The film, a satire of the depression that was steadily worsening in the United States, was a huge box office flop. After moving to MGM Studios, Rodgers and Hart were now relegated to writing individual songs for movies, like this one, featured in 1934's Manhattan melodrama.
Hear me loud. I could be good to a lover, but then I always discover the bad in every man.
If you think that sounds familiar, it probably does. In fact, the melody had already been used from a previously scrapped song, and after the release of Manhattan Melodrama, music publishers at MGM would pressure Larry Hart to rewrite the lyric, culminating in one of their few commercial hits of this time and one of their better-known songs today.
Blue moon, you saw me standing alone.
In 1934, just before the release of Manhattan Melodrama, Dick Rodgers made a visit to Irving Thalberg, MGM's vice president of production. He thanked him for the opportunity to work at the studio, but explained that both he and Larry Hart were heading back to New York to revive their Broadway career. Irving Thalberg just stared at him. He had no idea who Dick Rodgers was. It would be producer Billy Rose that would bring Rodgers and Hart back to Broadway with the musical spectacle Jumbo, staged at the cavernous 5,000-seat Hippodrome Theater. Part musical, part circus. In fact, Actors Equity categorized the show as a circus, which meant director George Abbott could rehearse his cast day and night. This was George Abbott's first time directing a musical, and in the coming years, his signature sense of style and pace would become emblematic in American musical comedy. Jumbo would ultimately open in November 1935 to the delight of audiences and critics alike.
Well, Jumbo is opening. Say something.
About Jumbo?
Jumbo, yeah, Jumbo.
Well, all I can say about Jumbo is, if it stays open as long as it stays closed, well, it'll be another Abby's Irish Rose.
Their next show would bring forth a collaboration with a young Russian choreographer named George Balanchine. While today he is best remembered for his contributions to the ballet world, Balanchine would choreograph the next 4 shows with Rodgers and Hart. His work on the musical On Your Toes, and especially the number Slaughter on 10th Avenue, was the first time where dance was integrated as part of the storytelling. It's this period in the 1930s where Rodgers and Hart are at their most influential. As in the 1920s, the songs transcended the shows that featured them. But in 1940, their musical Pal Joey set a new precedent for story and content. Set in the seedy nightclub scene of Chicago, the show presented characters that, as Dick Rodgers put it, don't have a bowing acquaintance with decency, and that was especially true of the show's title character. While today this is recognized as a fairly typical anti-hero, Pal Joey was an enigmatic leading character in his time. Only the charm of the actor playing him, Gene Kelly, in his first lead role, would win audiences over. While it would take over a decade for the show to be recognized for its achievements, it did produce probably one of the greatest songs ever written.
I'm wild again, beguiled again, a simpering, whimpering child again, bewitched, bothered, and bewildered am I.
Larry, who had been close friends with Vivian Siegel, proposed marriage. Years later, she would recount, "I loved Larry in a way, but not that way. I told him that we would always remain good friends, but that marriage was out of the question." Larry's lack of luck in love is sometimes attributed to his physical appearance. Standing at barely 5 feet, some people saying he resembled a dwarf, that he was ugly, which personally I don't really get. In fact, in a lot of his pictures, I actually think he's kind of cute. It seems that both in private and public life, with both men and women, he was deprived of a bond that he saw others have, like, for example, Dick Rodgers. But, like the Rodgers and Hart partnership, the picture never presented the whole truth.
My father was not an easy guy to get along with. He didn't have any best friends. He had one very good friend. All he wanted to do in his entire life was write music.
Dick Rodgers also became known from this period on as a compulsive womanizer, often with chorus girls from his own shows. His wife Dorothy likely knew of her husband's affairs, but said nothing.
She was an excellent chatelaine The house was great. It smelled good. The food was good. She was very pretty. She was everything you'd want in a wife in the 30s. But I don't think it was an easy marriage. And it was not an easy parent either. His whole world came from deep inside somewhere. I don't think he was a terribly nice man outside. But inside, I don't think it's possible to make the kinds of sounds he made without goodness in there somewhere.
By 1942, the Rodgers and Hart partnership was in trouble. Larry was continually unaccountable and often in poor health. They had actually finished the score of their musical By Jupiter in Larry's hospital room, where he had been diagnosed with alcohol poisoning. Dick Rodgers, anxious to keep working, told his partner that they had been offered the chance to write a musical adaptation of the play Green Grow the Lilacs. Larry was despondent and uninspired by the material. Dick was prepared for this. For the past year, he had been speaking with librettist and lyricist Oscar Hammerstein about the possibility of collaborating together. Dick had actually known Oscar before meeting Larry, and while he had achieved success in his own right on Broadway, Oscar was now without a project and a co-writer. Dick Rodgers gave Larry Hart an ultimatum: enter a sanatorium and sober up, or he would end the partnership and write with Oscar. According to Dick Rodgers, Larry didn't argue. He wished them well, left the room, and with that, the partnership of Rodgers and Hart was effectively over. This first collaboration of Rodgers and Hammerstein, of course, was Oklahoma, opening on Broadway in March of 1943. Today, Oklahoma is considered a landmark in the American theater, as the first fully integrated musical, cohesively combining song, choreography, and dramatic content. That summer, while Oklahoma was selling out at the St. James Theater, Dick was once again working with Larry, writing new songs for an upcoming revival for their 1927 musical, A Connecticut Yankee. This might have been a way to keep Larry motivated and working, though it's possible Dick's financial interest in the show may have been at play here too. And while it's also possible Dick Rodgers had kept him sober that summer, Larry was once again drinking excessively by the fall, and as we know now, causing a huge scene during the opening night performance. After this incident, he was rushed out of the theater and taken home by his sister-in-law to her apartment. By the next morning, however, Larry was gone. 3 days later, after cold and torrential downpours across the city, he was found suffering from pneumonia. In spite of the doctor's best efforts, Larry Hart passed away in Doctors Hospital on November 22, 1943. As the popularity of Rodgers and Hammerstein grew, memories of the Rodgers and Hart collaboration would fade into the background, and whenever their material did resurface, their story was often misrepresented, like in the 1948 film Words and Music. In the 1940s, Hollywood studios had found financial success in producing biographical movie musicals, celebrating the lives of popular songwriters. Ironically, the historical accuracy of these stories was never taken seriously. The films served more like vehicles for audiences to enjoy familiar songs set to elaborate musical numbers, which is how you get a movie where Cole Porter is portrayed as a devoted family man, played here by Cary Grant, which is something in itself. Words and Music today is most notable for being the last film where Mickey Rooney and Judy Garland shared the screen. But beyond flashy musical numbers and an array of Hollywood talent, the film doesn't offer an insightful look into the Rodgers and Hart story. Instead, it reads more like a mythical fairy tale of the partnership with little basis in reality. Unsurprisingly, there are no allusions to Larry Hart's homosexuality here. His alcoholism isn't expressly mentioned, nor does it factor in the ultimate cause of his death. Mickey Rooney's Larry Hart is charismatic, but only vaguely troubled. While he does adopt some of Larry's physical tics, his portrayal seems more in relation with his Mickey Rooney persona than anything else. Publicly, Dick Rodgers lauded the film, but privately, along with the rest of his family, he hated it. Dick himself remained tight-lipped about his partnership with Larry through the years, only occasionally admitting a sarcastic quip or a pejorative remark. His 1975 autobiography that Frank Rich of the New York Times called emotionally opaque offered little insight on Larry either, nor his own struggle with alcoholism, ironically the same struggle he had chastised Larry for. Richard Rodgers died in 1979 at the age of 77. After his death, it fell to Mary Rodgers Gettle to look after her father's legacy. While already being a successful Broadway composer herself, an accomplished author of children's books, one book of which became a certain popular film, Mary Rodgers would ensure the works of Richard Rodgers would continue to be produced. Throughout the rest of her life, she would always be transparent, speaking of her father with a candidness that might have horrified her parents. But this candor was always with sympathy, rather than judgment.
He was a deeply neurotic man, but so what else is new? Name me any genius who wasn't deeply neurotic. I think the writing the geniuses produce is an experience that alleviates their neurotic symptoms and their miserableness.
During his life, Larry Hart said he only ever wrote for character, that he never directly expressed himself. Looking back at some of his more poignant lyrics today, knowing what we know of his life, it seems impossible that he didn't draw from some experience, that as unsentimental as he claimed to be, his lyrics were often sentimental, longing, and romantic. While Larry Hart was never able to live authentically in his lifetime, it's astonishing how many people feel a reverence with him today. That's probably what moves me the most about his story, more than all of the songs and shows he was part of. What is also astonishing is how a man who lived so deeply within himself found a bond with someone who also retreated to an inner life. How in spite of their differences and the hardships that came from their partnership, they created a body of work that still holds up today. It's an irresistibly human story that will continue to live on in our imaginations. Thank you for watching this episode. If you like this content, please consider subscribing and sharing around. I want to thank my little army of subscribers. I really appreciate your support. Till next time, stay tuned.